Okay, folks, I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us today with our APIs do not equal integration broadcast. I'm Brian Pagano, coming to you from Apogee's headquarters in the normally sunny San Jose, California, and I'm joined by my colleague, Ed.
Hi, everyone. And you can follow us on Twitter.
We have the discussion group. If you don't have a question that you want to ask today, but you think of one tomorrow, or if we don't get time to answer all the questions today, feel free to join us on the API Craft Google group. It's a great place to have this discussion. We always put up the videos afterwards, and this video and many, many others will be on youtube.com/Apogee. We also put up the decks that we do into SlideShare. So that's at slideshare.com/Apogee. I think you guys are probably picking up on the pattern here. Also, I invite you guys to join us at community.apogee.com, where we've got all kinds of great content. If you want to dig into a particular aspect of APIs or start your journey there, it's a great place to do it. And then let's jump into the good stuff. So what are we doing here today? We're going to talk a little bit about integration, APIs, and how the two might not be equivalent. Is that right, Ed?
That is correct. Talk a little bit about what do we mean by integration, and then more importantly, I think for the focus on this presentation is really what do we mean by APIs, where they're used. I think by going through that and talking about sort of all the different API points in your architecture, that should give you kind of a perspective of where the overlap is or is not.
Great, and there's some pretty provocative statements here, so I can't wait to dig into it. All right, and I know a question that a few folks who have attended some of our previous broadcasts would probably be asking themselves. We've talked a few times about how APIs are not SOA++, how while there might be some overlap in a few functional areas, they're really solving for two different problem domains. So why, Ed, are we doing another discussion on a similar topic?
You know, I think that it's really a couple of things. One is we think that around APIs, kind of the center of gravity really comes from an application perspective. And oftentimes, a lot of the people who have historically been involved in implementing SOA, implementing integration, definitely, you know, the app developer and the app perspective has been important in the ecosystem, but hasn't necessarily been the first and foremost consideration. And so what we really want to make sure is that you're using the right tool for the job when you're sort of planning out your architecture, and that you're really taking sort of a broad perspective of who are all the participants and how are they going to be seeing things, not just kind of from a sort of service architecture or an integration standpoint. And so that's why we've been doing these webinars, I think, has been to kind of bring that broader perspective to the table.
Got it. And if I'm understanding you correctly, we focused heavily on the, if you will, back-end side of things, on the enterprise side, from the design of the APIs to the design of the services and business logic and data tier that's behind it, when we're talking about SOA versus APIs. And today, while we'll touch on that point, we're also going to, possibly for the first time, really focus on the front-end development side of things.
Yeah, very, very definitely front-end, and very definitely the application architecture from that perspective.
Okay, excellent. You know me, I always like to start with first principles and define our terms so we're not talking around each other the whole time. And so you've helpfully defined integration for us.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily have defined it, actually. I've put some of the hallmarks on there because I think that people using these terms tend to use them in very broad ways, but when you look at it from a specific technology standpoint, you see sort of a number of different vendor products and so on. And I think this is a point you've made in some of your prior webinars, that it makes sense to look at these components of your architecture through a couple of different lenses. One is, what are the architectural precepts that are the underpinnings of this? But then you also have to take into consideration how they manifest in different vendor products. So, for all of these, there is, SOA, we in previous webinars we've defined what does that mean from an architectural standpoint, but it also has a very definite meaning from a vendor standpoint too. These things have to be concretely embodied in various forms of technology and so on. So, from integration, it helps to talk about it the same way as well. And it is often a back-end to back-end mechanism, although application to application integration obviously is an important use case as well. We strongly associate connectors, often pre-built for specific types of applications that might be mechanisms for getting at an application's underlying data in ways that perhaps the application developer didn't originally intend. And then there are certain technologies, as you and I have discussed before, things like message buses, service buses, and so on, that are often closely associated with integration.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I fly around the world talking to folks about integration, when they say integration to me, while there's a lot of clever things you can do with integration, there's a lot of possible meanings. What they usually mean is, hey Brian, we've got a bunch of systems in line of business, division A.
Right.
We've got a bunch of systems in division B, possibly through a merger or acquisition or something, and we need to make them talk. Either we need to exchange data or we need some service level functionality. And at the risk of oversimplifying with broad stroke, that's what people tend to mean when they say integration. And I think painting it like that makes it very easy to see why what we're talking about with APIs is really solving for a different class of problem. This webinar is brought to us by the letter A.
Yes. A colorful letter A at that. But, this is one of those points that I personally love to belabor, which is that in defining the problem in the three-letter acronym, we often strip out kind of the fact that this is an application tier technology. And we're not the exclusive definers of the term API, but it's generally considered, again, the application programming interface. Application is right there, front and center. So
Yep.
As a consequence, APIs and how they're used are also very definitely affected by the way that we've seen the nature of applications being re-architected.
Okay.
We went from a period, you and I remember when we got into this industry, the client server and your application teams were sitting around writing Visual Basic or building Lotus applications and so on, and we went from a transition where everything moved into a very monolithic development in the case of web applications, which had the benefit that by throwing everything into this monolithic web stack, that everything that was not inside that web stack then had a lot of the pressure taken off of them to deal with sort of messy real world situations. And so that allowed the rest of the architecture to become a little bit more pristine, if you will. Right. But now we have mobile as being one of the catalysts that's blowing up the application architecture again. And so you now can't sort of sweep everything under the rug into your application server. And that's having implications. And one of the most profound impacts of that is the fact that API usage is becoming a mainstream developer technology. And I think one of the things we'll see later on in these slides is the fact that we are getting to the point where every developer, regardless of who they are, level of experience and so on, will not be just consuming APIs, they will be building APIs as well. And that's going to have some implications as well that further will show the bifurcation of APIs and integration.
Okay, that's quite a statement. I can't wait till we dig into that a little more.
I can't wait till I attempt to prove that.
Okay, great. But no, I love the point you made that I had honestly never thought about it in quite this frame before, that we have gone from thick clients, desktop clients, back like when we both got into the business doing those kind of things, into everything went web.
Yep.
Everything was a web app, even if you were still within the four walls of the company. But that in many ways, mobile has brought us full circle back to rich clients that are running natively. It's not on a big, heavy desktop machine anymore, but
right.
They are thick clients running natively. I had not thought of it that way before.
Yep.
And now we have to look at things in black and white.
Yes, exactly.
We have the word app in a rectangle.
Yes, and so what this is basically providing in stark illustration is that often we think about the app, as this black box, or in this case, a black outline of a box. But for many of us, that's kind of our starting point. And so the application typically sits within some form of environment. For a long time, it's been the application server.
Sure.
And whether you were using the Java stack and you were using, your Tomcats or your, WebLogics or WebSpheres or what have you, you had this container that was executing your web application. You may have you had the equivalence of that in the Microsoft world and your IIS and your .NET
Sure.
and what have you. But the point is running your presentation and business logic typically tightly coupled together, but also your data access logic as well. But almost everything was sitting there. Typically running in some form of environment, used to be dedicated, then became virtualized. Now we're increasingly seeing this lightweight virtualization, things like Docker and LXC and so on that are making possible for enterprises to have their own essentially private platforms as a service. But the point is, it still comes down to containerization and your app running in this container. And so the interesting thing then comes with the fact that not everything that the app needs is in that container. There's stuff sitting outside that box.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's where, we tend to talk about the quote unquote back end. And that's going to have the things that the application needs, such as data, storage, other services that it has to talk to.
Right. It's a pretty rare app that can be completely self-contained in today's world.
Unless you're doing something pretty horrendous, perhaps executing off of the file system itself. Honestly, I mean, if you look at what people do in some PHP apps, they may have an embedded database, they may have, they may be using the file system. I think most enterprise architectures and most enterprise architects would justifiably be a little dubious of that approach. But yeah, I mean, you could conceivably be doing that. But yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking like mapping location information. You're
Right.
probably pulling in from a partner, weather information, market information, stuff from partners, ads, offers. There's just a lot of stuff that's probably coming from somewhere else outside of your development team's application.
Oh, very, very definitely. I think, and we'll look at that in the next couple of slides. But if you are doing engagement tier apps, which is really where a lot of the effort is these days, then you've got a lot of external resources. But at minimum, you're going to have some set of internal resources, and we're sort of euphemistically all lumping them together as the quote unquote back end. But
on that note, could we just, I didn't mean to interrupt
Yeah.
you there. There's been a couple of questions just to define our terms a little further.
Yes.
So, one is the difference between back end and application, the way we're talking today, just to make sure we're all clear on what we mean.
So in this case, what we are talking about that. So first, I want to elaborate on these slides. When we say app, we are talking a full. So far in these slides, we're actually talking about a full web app. We're not talking about a mobile app yet. This is really from the perspective of the server side application developer. Okay. Somebody who is using Java Enterprise Stack or Ruby on Rails or whatever. But still, it's that server side perspective. So we have not yet introduced mobile and the client side app in a meaningful way yet into these slides.
Okay, so in this case, application is a web application so far in the conversation.
Yeah.
And back end, we're talking about any services, middleware, back end systems that are providing content to this application.
Yep.
Okay, and then there was one other question when we're talking about monolithic presentation of business logic we just said a minute ago. The question is, are we suggesting that no one was doing n-tier or multi-tiered applications back during that era?
Oh, not at all. No, of course. There have always been people doing that. I think what you would find, though, and of course, this is one of these things where everybody says, oh, no, my organization has always been doing proper n-tier application design. The majority of web applications that get built, and perhaps not in your specific organization, but sort of across software development world, and even if I limit that just to enterprise development, we are seeing a lot of basic, classic Tomcat, JSPs, business logic, JDBC or ORM, all of that, all in your Java, application server, talking to a database.
Right.
But yeah, no, I mean that is the predominant form of application development, and there's actually. We didn't really come prepared with all that supporting data, but it would be an interesting future topic. We definitely, if you take a look at the surveys of development that have been done from all the analyst firms and so on, that is the predominant form of application development.
Fair enough. We're not saying it's 100%.
No, absolutely not. No, and yeah, exactly. So this basically is talking about this idea that your app definitely is going to need resources. So you aren't going to really be able to do the one-tier app. There's going to be at least
right.
There should be at least 2 tiers: database and storage, email services, but also a lot of other back-end services that your application is talking to. And as we say here on the slide, primary mechanisms actually have been kind of, I would say, sort of the native protocols, the JDBC and so on, however you want to characterize those. Then integration-based. And API-based is becoming increasingly popular in the back end. But definitely integration, is probably has its home in this piece of the equation. Tier code talking to backend systems.
Yeah, and especially app to app, especially if they're back-end apps or back-end systems, back-end data stores. That's the bread and butter. No one is suggesting that integration is not a great idea in that situation. At least we're not suggesting that.
Exactly.
Maybe there's some guy out there somewhere. But
well,
it's
somebody
not us.
could, but yeah. So in fact, and this is really interesting, one of the things that we've seen that we point a lot of people to is, so there's this idea of 12-factor apps that has emerged, and there's a link to it at the bottom. Adam Wiggins, who's one of the founders of Heroku, documenting what works best for apps running in a platform as a service, like Heroku. And so one of those 12 factors, factor number 4, is the idea of backing services, and the idea that treat backing services as attached resources. And what he's doing is basically codifying or being a little more prescriptive on the idea that you've got your executing web application, and ideally that's running in some form of elastic container. And that might be your Cloud Foundry, or it might be Heroku, or it might be things you're building with Docker, or it might be things you're building with VMware, or whatever. But the point is your application execution logic, and then you essentially are attaching to those instances these back-end resources, these attached resources, which are your databases, which might be your storage and so on. And the examples, this particular graph came from his 12 Factors app ebook, but these may not be external services. The examples he uses they could be internal as well.
Right. No, it's a subtle distinction though. I like the idea of where attaching resources. Right. I mean, it's mostly semantics at that point. It's not changing your architecture, your application design, but thinking of them in those terms might then inform some of the decisions you're making. Thinking of these as resources that I'm just maybe temporarily attaching to my application.
Well, I think that a lot of these considerations also come from a DevOps perspective, and the idea that particularly when you're dealing with these things at internet scale, but I think these apply for all levels of scale, you may want to be able to scale these independently. And also take them offline and bring them online and upgrade them independently as well. So that's part of why this is being espoused.
Got it. Makes perfect sense.
Now, from a cloud-based services standpoint, for cloud apps, we already see some of this practice pretty widespread. And so, database as a service, there's plenty of choices, DynamoDB, SimpleDB, database.com, all of these things. So the idea of, hey, I'm going to use my database as an API-based service has actually been something that this is actually a real thing. Lots of apps are doing it. Storage as a service, again, Amazon S3 is an incredibly popular API-based service for a reason. Email as a service, even for enterprise apps, most folks in IT who are managing their email servers really do not want the apps going and hitting that. In fact, they'll go and say, look, you want to send email, use Amazon's email service, use something like SendGrid. I don't want your random apps going and spamming through my mail server.
The corporate
email
server. Yeah, exactly. So you're saying that if I were to build just today, not in the future, if I were to build a cloud-based application today, almost inherently, I would be following this methodology.
You would be, and you very well might be, even in an enterprise context, you might be using external API-based services for those back-end capabilities.
Okay, fantastic.
And then the counterpart to that is internal resources, because not everybody is deploying these things as cloud-based apps, and so what we're seeing is a lot of these are API-based. Most modern databases are coming with a REST-based access to them, in addition to sort of the classic native mechanisms.
Sure.
There has been, at least from my perspective and developers that I talk to, there is a preference to the API-based approach, perhaps versus kind of an interclassic integration approach or an ESB-based approach and so on. It's a developer preference thing, but I think that you're starting to see this really take hold.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, as you know, I come from an enterprise IT background. I happen to really like integration. There's a lot of great integration projects. I like some of those technologies, but the fact is you're going to have to learn something either way.
Right.
The new development team that you're onboarding today, they're going to have to learn something. What I like about the API-driven approach is that we're not prescribing which programming language they're using, which IDE they use, which testing tools, which methodology. They're already productive doing something, and we can mostly allow them to just continue being productive that way. Sure, they have to learn a few of the entities, the resources, and a RESTful API, but again, that's going to be, if we're following good design, singulars, plurals, it's going to be pretty easy to grasp versus, I'm not saying you can't have very well-designed integration layers, you certainly can, but you're going to have to learn something either way. And I do prefer the standard API approach to that.
It seems to be taking hold, and I think some of it is the influence of cloud-based development techniques, but nonetheless, that's what we're seeing. So the next slide is talking about sort of the next place we see APIs, which is really on the front end. And this is going back to the point that we made at the beginning of the introduction of mobile and new forms of client technology. In this illustration, the part front end could be your native client, or it could be your HTML5 JavaScript app, and so on. So the point is, this is a usage of APIs that very definitely fits within the application development tier. And when we go down to the next slide, we see this is kind of your classic mobile API architecture. I think we reused this slide from last week's great "Why does mobile need an API" presentation we did with Forrester. In this case, what you're seeing here is kind of the multiple tiers. In the middle of that dotted line is very definitely your REST API on the wire. But you've got application code on the device talking to application code on the server, and there's an API in the middle of it. And it's not, this could be the same, the code on the left and the code on the right. So that, that white box over on the left and the blue box on the right, that could be the same person who wrote that. In this case, they are using the API as a mechanism of partitioning their application code. It's not a mechanism for abstraction. It's not a mechanism for reuse. It's not a mechanism for loose coupling. It's simply whoever the developer, he or she had to go and segment the front end from, their back end, all within the sphere of their application project.
Got it. In this particular case.
In this particular case.
Got it.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah, because APIs can be used for those other things.
Right. So this slide is just reiterating that. Mobile clients talking to server-side APIs. And what we're calling out here is we have to be, as architects, we have to be respective of the fact that this is API usage that's happening somewhat outside of our province. This is the application team. This is, and this won't be the first case we see it, actually. We're going to see a little further down another case where APIs are a technology that the application team is using for part of their code base to talk to another part of their code base. But if you're sitting there and you're saying, okay, no, I am the enterprise architect in charge of APIs. I know all APIs my organization is using. You may not be exactly accurate. This is going to be one of those cases where there are probably there's API usage happening. And in fact, in many cases, this is one of the most predominant and critical ways that your organization may be using APIs, security implications, scalability implications that your organization needs to be aware of, but very definitely in the application tier.
Got it. So now there's been a couple of quick questions around some of our statements around the ESBs, which we're kind of using as an umbrella term as one of the best representatives of integration tier technologies. And some people did point out that, well, it's not really an either or.
Sure.
Between those, the fact is most people are going to put an API layer in front of their integration tier as the mechanism for exposure, consumption, delivery of that functionality. So that was a good point raised by someone out there. That, and there were a few questions about will APIs replace a combination of ESB and SOAP, and again, I don't think that's what we're positing here.
No, not at all. And so here's one of the things that I would say to that. It is really important for people who are thinking about their service strategy, regardless of how it's being delivered, whether it's being delivered through message-oriented middleware, whether it's being delivered through REST-based, whether it's SOAP-based, and so on. To be aware of exactly how much has already been happening within their application server development. A lot of, this would treat as a black box. And so what they may end up discovering is that, for example, my mobile app, I can't just put a REST gateway on top of my ESB and my mobile app's talking directly to it. For some services, they can. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that maybe have been running in their web application servers that suddenly also needs to get exposed as well. Maybe you want to expose it out through the ESB or maybe not. That's going to be something that you have to figure out. But you'll find out that there's a whole lot of interaction logic and business logic that might be in that's very specific purpose for the application. And some of these use cases are shedding a light on that, I think.
Got it. Yeah, and I think we've always said there are some good uses, like with any technology. There's whatever was built to do it probably does pretty well. And I think we've done some other broadcasts where we talk about here's the places where you might want to use a guaranteed messaging, asynchronous kind of technology back there. Some really good uses for that.
Right.
So I really don't think it's an either or.
Yeah,
we're talking here today.
Yep. And so this is getting into sort of the third case of APIs on the app tier, which is app-to-app integration. and this is going to be the mechanism by which your applications talk to other applications, how they talk to you. How are you going to enable that? And APIs are not the exclusive mechanism to do that, and we talk about this a little bit on this slide. There's really sort of two schools of thought, and this was an interesting conversation that you and I had earlier this morning as we were reviewing these slides, where I actually expected you to advocate one position, we're advocating very different, the opposite of it. But the point is that there is one school of thought that goes and says that basically every application developer is application team is kind of in charge of its own destiny, so they're going to do their stuff. They're going to essentially open up a set of functionality via APIs with all the mechanisms associated with that, documentation and so on, that other application developers can use. But it's more like, here are my APIs. Learn them if you want to use them. And then me as an application developer, when I want to use somebody else's, I go and find those APIs and I learn them. And this mechanism has the advantage, which is that I don't have to I'm building my application, I don't really have to go into a meeting and really I don't have to block my thread of execution to get everybody in and say, we got to all get on the same page. And then the opposite counterpart is to go and say, no, actually, we should come up with a more prescriptive model for application data interchange and expose that and define it in a standard way for our organization. That way, we don't get into that problem where I have to go and learn 1,700 APIs in order to do anything. And so there's definitely a trade-off on this, and people espousing both approaches. And so when I looked at it, this was a case where I was actually being a little cautious and going and saying, well, I can imagine hopping on the magic bus, i.e. the message bus, and getting all that perfect canonical data in my big XML payload. But you brought a very interesting perspective to that, which was actually the opposite of what I would have expected to hear from you.
Yeah, I was curious where you're going with that. I thought you were going to say I was advocating for bureaucracy in meetings. That's what you expected. My
well,
position.
Well, of course,
No, because I come from an enterprise IT background, enterprise architecture. So in some aspects, we do have to control things a little bit. That is our job, to make sure that things meet security standards and compliance standards. But ultimately, what I was concerned with was not controlling it with meetings, but that things were following some best practice, meaning that we were productive, that it didn't take us a lot of time and expense to get new ideas out to market, and that things were within reason reusable. And so the fact is I've been through those giant projects where we defined canonical data formats. But see, the world isn't static. Things change. Then we merge with some other company. We bring out new lines of business, new things get developed. They weren't developed around this. The model didn't account for these things. And so we have to start all over again, or at least go back and do another iteration, bring these things in. The kind of stuff that came off the message buses. And again, I love message buses. Some of the happiest times of my life writing code for those message buses.
Right.
But
you can't beat the JMS API.
It was, exactly. But the stuff coming off, even though we'd done all this work to define it, was still pretty random. There were a lot of meetings necessary, a lot of documentation reading necessary to consume this stuff. And we're living in an era of consumability right now. That's the name of the game. So I definitely prefer the APIs, and not just because I'm here with Team Apogee. I actually think it's a lighter weight, more agile, better way to get ideas and apps to the market for the good of the business.
So this was kind of what we were saying, was there's definitely, so first the point that you're making is that in the real world of using things like message-oriented middleware for your integration to between apps and so on, some companies definitely have been able to get great productivity and agility gains by tightly defining those in a way where everybody knows what they're putting and taking off, and they don't have to go and actually learn everybody else's APIs. But you're also saying from a practical standpoint, for a lot of organizations, that didn't really happen. And so this idea that somehow using an integration mechanism for app-to-app communications versus each app publishing their APIs and different apps consuming them, that trade-off is often a false choice, and that your perspective was that productivity and agility were something that you were sensitive to.
Especially in today's market.
Yep.
If it's not our traditional competitors, it's some over-the-top player trying to eat our lunch. So yeah, speed is becoming much more important than it was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I just came back from the Forrester conference, and they talked about digital predators and digital prey, which presented that in stark terms.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like out there.
Right.
Okay, and now you're going to blow our minds.
This is talking about microservice architecture, which is something that we're seeing a lot of discussion by various architects online. It is definitely implemented by a lot of the digital native companies. Amazon is one that really their actual conversations when they talk about APIs. A lot of it comes from this, but also folks like Netflix. But this is the idea where essentially what we're talking about is I've been a Java developer for a long time, and I've used things, various forms of, well, things like Spring, the Spring architecture, with essentially, your components and being able to use things like dependency injection and so on. Mm-hmm. You're building your web app. It doesn't have to be a web app, but building as a set of components. And what we're seeing is that these components now actually are being turned into services, microservices, because they're being built by the application team. They're not being built by like two teams to talk to each other. This is just, me and you decide to build an app, and you're like, okay, I'm going to build a user service. I'm going to say, oh, that's cool. I'm going to go build this front end service. And whereas in the past, you and I might have gone and sort of collaborated, pair programming or whatever, we might have gone and said, okay, let's define some Java classes and interfaces.
Right.
And we would have done that because our code was all executing inside a Spring context. And we would have been doing this all in process in this communications.
Yep.
But now we're seeing, for a number of reasons, that rather than that, we might go and say, hey, let's just define an API. Right, and rather than running in that same process, we might be running in two different containers. And part of this is because containerization is getting so much cheaper. It used to be a big deal. Spinning up a virtual instance was 10% of the cost of, or 10% less of the cost of spinning up a dedicated server. But you had a lot of you were reducing the overhead of going and finding a server nobody was using or installing a new server. Now we're actually talking about the costs of spinning up a new instance are a fraction of that cost. And so application developers have gone and started to say, you know what, if I'm sitting there building with you, I'm going to say, Brian, you know what, your components hog CPU resources, because
they probably do.
They probably do. Yeah. I mean, and so you know what, I want to write my code here. I don't want it to slow down because you're doing something. So take your stuff, take your component and run it on a different instance.
Go to my own runtime.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Go to your own runtime. Or it might be, however unlikely, that you decided that you really liked Ruby on Rails or whatever. You've gone and decided, hey, you went and read something on Go this weekend, and decided you're going to write it in Go language or something. These are all increasingly possibilities that happen because of labor market, labor availability. It might turn out that you joined some other from some other team that was working with some other language. And so again, we might go and say, okay, we're going to segment inside our application these things that previously would have been components talking to each other at the Java class level. You're going to give, we're going to do them via APIs.
Yeah.
Now, eventually, these microservices might grow up to be full-fledged services. But right now, we're just more concerned with building our architecture and segmenting it so we can scale them independently, so we can use the right languages for the job. You might be doing something with concurrency. You might say, highly concurrent, and so you might say, I'm going to use Scala for that.
Right.
Or it might be something that is more expressive in using Ruby for. And so again, this allows us to break up our application into these components. But where I would have used, Java-based components, class-based components before, they're now basically services. And so the idea and the reason why we're bringing this up is it is, again, yet one more case where APIs, REST APIs, being built and deployed by developers outside of what we might commonly think of as our enterprise API initiative.
Got it. And this is, in my opinion, this is a mind-blowing topic. Because when I first saw this, I thought, I would be just as guilty if I whipped up a little development team today, started making an app. I would, whatever OO language I was going to use, I would start defining my classes, my abstract classes, my interfaces, and we'd start passing them around. And the more I thought about it, why would I make somebody else use the language I like to use, which happens to be Ruby right now?
I hadn't realized that was your. We should talk about it in advance.
No. Well, before you took a. Yeah, I was actually going to do a disclaimer there that any language flame war that started is solely Ed's. You said.
I could come up with some Ruby.
No, you said Scala and Ruby without a note of derision in your voice. And
No,
I appreciate that.
Well, but you know what? I mean, honestly, this is one of these things where I always give the example of Node.js. I mean, Node.js is one of these ones where I would have been reading about it on Hacker News, and I would have been like, what will the kids think of next? I mean, and I say this as somebody who's been doing JavaScript programming for a good 15 years now, but it still would have been like, okay, server-side JavaScript. Yeah. Now, it is one of my favorite, development languages and for server-side stuff, and we as a company are doing a ton of stuff with Node.js. But when we go and talk to large telcos, I find that they're using Node.js. So this is one of those ones where it's like 2 years ago, people on Hacker News talking about it. Now, you're talking about sort of the largest IT organizations on the planet going and saying, sure, Node.js. Well, at some point, what that means is that somebody somewhere in many places is going and saying, okay, hey, this problem I solved with Java code, and this problem I want to solve with Node, I have to have them talking together, and the easiest way to do that is basically by microservices.
So it's all the more reason to look at this kind of architecture, as you're saying, because it's now becoming a little more heterogeneous of an environment. Think about the skill sets you're hiring as an organization or partnering with out in the field, right? You want to make that as broad as possible, not maybe restrict yourself just to one language.
Well, it's going to have a lot of implications. I mean, you and I, previous to when we were prepping for this, we were talking about things like databases. We remember the time when the database, as somebody I as a Java developer, we'd be like, oh, the database technology. Well, you know what? I mean, I would go and find the database guy in the company who would go and define the tables and so on, and he would actually give me the queries. Versus now, not to say that people have gotten actually better at understanding databases, but the reality is that sort of, the Prometheus has stolen the fire, and whether people are setting fire to the forest or not, whether we can't help it. But the point is, same thing. At a certain point, everybody is going to be using this. So the point on this is reiterating the fact that everybody in your organization is not just consuming APIs, they are building APIs.
Yeah.
And they will continue to do that, even more so than you were probably anticipating. And so you need to be aware of that. How your organization addresses that, this is both sort of a sociological thing, like should you be actually training people on best practices on REST API design? How, from a governance standpoint, how will you be aware of these? All of these things that we talked about are places where things like security, consistency of security, still becomes important.
Yeah.
Even if somebody's building a service for microservice part, somebody later might be like, "Hey, what the heck? Let's open that up to outside usage."
Yeah, which often happens.
Which does happen. I mean, the promotion of a microservice to a full-fledged external service is a very slippery slope. Happens very quickly, and so suddenly you need to have a uniform, secure way to do that, as well as sort of the standard way of documenting these. I mean, should you be using something like Swagger as the mechanism for making sure that these are all published into standard way? So a lot of things to think about. The big takeaway should be looking around your teams, your organizations. Almost every software developer you talk to that you interact with, or more importantly, the ones you're not interacting with, are all building, not just consuming, but also building APIs. It's going to be pervasive.
And that to me is one of the key points of this discussion.
Right.
It's a gravitational shift.
Yes.
Like I didn't even notice it when I was first looking over this content and say, what a bold statement that is, and very true. I mean, it's one of those things that once you see it, you can't not see it anymore.
Right.
It's just there that I am as guilty as anyone of thinking of APIs as being an edge technology, being something that sits basically as the bridge between the back end and presentation and consumption tiers out there, meaning it's kind of the domain of enterprise IT.
Right.
And the idea here is, while that's still true.
Or a special governance team.
Or special API team is special. But exactly, it's special in some way.
Right.
But the fact is that basically every application that gets built from here forward, or most of them, are going to have, even within those development teams and certainly across development teams, they're going to be communicating via APIs. And that's to me, that is mind-blowing. That is an absolute gravitational shift in how I personally think about APIs.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I had the same perspective when I started to come across this stuff.
Let's bring it home.
Yeah, our point on this was that you needed to be aware, you as an API professional.
Me personally.
Well, you personally,
yes.
But hopefully the folks that we're interacting with, the people who are watching this video, when you were thinking about APIs within your architecture and within your organization, it is very important to be aware of this idea that there are a number of non-integration use cases that are driving APIs. Now, what that means for your organization is going to be a different thing. Like I said, this may simply be that you've got to take a wider perspective in educating people on the right way to use these technologies. It may have implications from a governance standpoint, may have implications from a security standpoint, but the point is, all of your APIs are not passing through a magic black box somewhere. They're not passing through a single team that blesses APIs and designs them. They are happening everywhere. And what that means to you from a technology, as well as kind of social standpoint is something that you need to craft for your organization. Might be an interesting follow-up point in sort of how do you govern and manage in this type of world, but it's happening.
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent point. And that probably is a topic. We focus more on the technology, the high-level architecture here. There is going to be a governance aspect. You can grip the bar so too tightly. Right. And so...
well, I think there was an opportunity for a Star Wars analogy there.
There's always an opportunity for a Star Wars analogy.
What was it, the planet slipping through your...
Exactly. So we had another question about asking if we could shed a little more light on why using APIs from the developer standpoint here, why using APIs might be easier or harder than going directly to an ESB or a backend service.
Well, I mean, I think that so question of being easier or harder. I think it's really going to depend on the service, but I think that for the developer, there is the ability, I think, to hone in specifically on the use case, on what it is that they're trying to do, drill down into ideally a nicely defined RESTful API that's going to fit, the pattern of access that they're trying to go to. And as we've talked about in previous RESTful designs, to some degree, I mean, I don't want to be a complete cheerleader on things like REST APIs, but they are somewhat self-describing in nature. Oftentimes, that is not necessary. That is not the case through, as we were talking about with JMS. My JMS interface is going to look the same to me no matter what. There has to be you are going to need sideband documentation information to figure out what you're going to be putting into that. Otherwise, you're essentially driving onto a superhighway in your clown car. It may or may not work.
That's exactly what it's like. Yeah.
Yes.
No, and then there's also actually all merit aside, there's simply the labor force. I keep bringing that up because this is something I've struggled with, finding people who understand technologies. The fact is that most of the folks who are building mobile apps, certainly, and web apps, modern web apps, they are more familiar with using APIs. That's the mechanism they're used to.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's not an either or, but I think that is an important consideration. And of course, I mean, look, I think that the documentation and reasons why integration might be superior to you are also plentiful. But I think that the API mechanism is definitely one that's growing. And more importantly, I think that portability of applications from more controlled environments to cloud-based deployments, whether it is fully public cloud or private cloud within a Cloud Foundry or OpenShift or what have you, is something that most people who are coming up with their application delivery strategies are grappling with. And a lot of the integration mechanisms do not transfer as nicely, despite what a lot of vendors are doing, don't translate as nicely to cloud-based environments. Again, that's one of those statements that it could also be debated both ways.
Right, we've had the hot topic here definitely seems to be our talking about ESBs versus APIs, and we know this from prior conversations we've had. And I want to reiterate again, we're not talking either or. There's great uses for both of them. They're saying that some people feel that it's a kind of a false dichotomy for us to put these things up, and I think we addressed that a little bit earlier in the talk. That some people say to me, "Well, I've got an ESB, so I don't need APIs." It's kind of like saying I've got an oven, so I don't need a refrigerator. I mean, they're both used as part of the food life cycle. They're both used as part of the chain that you go through with food, but they serve some different purposes. And there may even be a little overlap. I mean, they can both be containers for food, for example, but they're really solving for different problem domains. So I really think it is a false dichotomy to say either or in the way that most people are using them. Obviously, you can abuse architecturally either layer and be doing things that really should be done on the other side.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree with that. I think that again, the point that I would be careful in taking too much comfort or security in the idea that there's some people are going to hear what we. So I do, I'll be the first to go and say yes. You know what? Your ESB is a powerful integration technology. You're going to use it. We are not talking about replacing that. That is there. It's there for a reason. But I would also very much challenge this idea that your ESB could satisfy your API. And what I would further go and say is, by that same logic, your ESB could replace your app server by simply going and putting an XLT filter to translate those XML payloads directly into web pages. It is exactly the same statement. And then when I say that to somebody, they go, "Oh, no, I'm going to have this app server," and that's where I go back and say, "Yeah." So that's the thing. You are almost always putting this app server to translate what's happening on your ESB to some form of user interaction engagement. And this is, I think, the big mind shift is that a lot of folks are not seeing the APIs as a engagement tier technology. They are seeing it as a integration tier technology.
Or at best exposure.
Exactly, at best exposure.
Yeah.
And so that's the part that that's one of the concepts that I would hope people would take away from. It's exactly, you would never serve web pages directly out of your ESB. Saying your API is going to be served directly out of your ESB is essentially, I could think of maybe a dozen cases where you might actually make that work. It'd be an interesting experiment to do, but it just really wouldn't work that well.
Well, and fundamentally, it's confusing, which a lot of people do, understandably, confusing exposure for consumption.
Exactly.
Great. So I think we're about out of time here. I really appreciate everyone joining us once again today. I knew this was going to be an exciting topic. You backed up. You made some controversial statements early on, Ed, but you backed them up, I feel. It's definitely changed the way I'm going to look at APIs going forward. And I think about APIs quite a lot, as you might imagine.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you so much. Again, you can join us at community.apogee.com. A lot of good information is there also. We have a variety of resources that we talked about earlier. We give all kinds of stuff away. We love talking about this stuff. They can barely stop us.
Good stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you guys have a great day. Any questions didn't get answered, feel free to join us in the Google group. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.